These stories were pulled from Reddit. Their authors will be displayed at the beginning of each story. Want to make sure they are given a shout out for sharing their stories. When I was younger, we would often visit my grandparents during the holidays, even though we didn't live in the same town. My aunt lived just 2 houses down from them. The woman who lived in the house between them was eerie and unsettling. She was a large woman, towering over 6 feet tall, and she always wore logging chains around her neck paired with a dress and heavy work boots. I only ever saw her outside, either working in her garden or scrubbing the exterior of her house. Yes, scrubbing the actual building itself. She did this often. Whenever we were nearby, she would yell at us kids, calling us all sorts of names and telling us the devil was coming for us. The adults always warned us to leave her alone and avoid her at all costs. We used to sprint between my aunt's house and my grandparents' because every time you passed by, you could see her watching from the windows. It was creepy, and none of us ever dared to go alone. One Halloween, one of my cousins dared us to trick or treat at her house. I was terrified but didn't want to be called a chicken, especially since we were going as a group. Someone rang the doorbell, and suddenly there was a lot of banging from inside the house, like doors slamming. When she finally answered, she was holding a severed head in her hands. We all screamed and ran. The adults later told us it was just a Halloween prop and scolded us for bothering her, saying we deserved to be scared for not listening. About a month later, my parents got a phone call with shocking news. The woman had tried to kill my aunt while she was bringing in groceries, holding my young cousin in her arms. The woman had crept up behind my aunt with a rope saw, slipped it over her head, and started sawing at her neck. My aunt panicked and began kicking the door. Thankfully, my uncle came running and managed to beat the woman down with a fire poker. When the police investigated, they discovered that the woman had been digging tunnels beneath her house, which extended under my aunt's, my grandparents', and a neighbor's homes. She had been hauling the dirt up and using it in her raised garden beds. Even more disturbing, they found some sort of underground shrine with a few severed heads around it. My aunt survived the attack, but she now has a long scar across her neck as a reminder of that terrifying day. Firstly, my wife is also a Redditor and has been deeply traumatized by our recent experience. She doesn't like to talk about it, so to protect her privacy and avoid anyone messaging her, I'm using a throwaway account. In February 2010, my wife and I bought our first house. We fell in love with it immediately. It had everything we wanted and more. For the first month, things were great. We spent our time painting, decorating, and getting the house just the way we liked it. Then strange things started happening. At first, it was small stuff, like items being moved to completely different rooms than where they belonged. I assumed my wife was just forgetting to put things back in their places. The house also started creaking loudly, which I figured was just normal settling, as new houses tend to do. One day, while we were preparing dinner in the kitchen, we heard something that shook us both. The stairs are right next to the kitchen entrance, so any noise from upstairs is clearly audible. I turned off the water at the sink, and as soon as I did, we both heard a cough from upstairs. We don't have kids, no one was visiting, the windows were shut, and the TV wasn't on. A chill ran down my spine, and I could feel the blood drain from my face. I glanced at my wife. She'd gone pale and looked terrified. Someone was in our house upstairs. I quickly grabbed the sharpest knife I could find while my wife called the police. I stood at the base of the stairs listening. A loud pop echoed, the same type of creak I had been hearing for weeks. My hands were shaking as my wife whispered to the 911 operator, explaining we thought we had an intruder. The police arrived within minutes, thankfully because they had been patrolling nearby. One officer cautiously walked up the stairs, gun drawn, calling out, "This is the police!" "Is anyone upstairs?" Silence. I followed behind him as we checked each room. First bedroom, closet, empty. The half bath, empty. Finally, we reached my office where my PC is set up. No one there, and the closet was empty too. I started to feel foolish, thinking I had wasted the officer's time over nothing. We turned to leave the room and suddenly, creak, right above us. My heart nearly stopped. In my office closet, there's an attic access. The officer pulled down the steps and called out again, "Is anyone up there?" "This is the police." Still no response. He shone his flashlight up into the attic and peeked in. There, kneeling in the attic, was a man in his 40s staring right at him. The officer immediately drew his gun and ordered the man to come down with his hands behind his head. The man complied without a word, not making eye contact with anyone. He was scruffy, wearing dirty clothes, and looked disheveled. My wife and I were in complete shock. We hadn't realized the full extent of what was happening until that moment. Later, we learned from the police that the man was homeless and had been living in the house while it was still on the market. He said the door had been left unlocked by a realtor, so he let himself in and stayed. Whenever people came to view the house, he would hide in the attic on the second floor. After we bought the house, he continued living there for a month without us ever knowing. It still gives me chills to think about it. Don't ignore strange noises at night. You might have someone secretly living in your attic. When I was a freshman in college, I was on a film shoot near Barstow, along Route 66. We were filming at the cafe made famous by the movie Baghdad Cafe. The property also had an abandoned motel attached to it, and that's where we were shooting this unbelievably bad horror film. The motel's floor was littered with papers, which I initially thought were just remnants from when the motel was still in business. As the shoot went on, we started picking up the papers and reading them out of curiosity. What we found was bizarre, handwritten letters from the 1970s, possibly never sent. They were addressed to various people and began normally enough but quickly devolved into disturbing and unhinged ramblings. The writer talked about how they were watching him and described some really dark, unsettling things. The handwriting grew more erratic and chaotic as we pieced the letters together in chronological order. It was clear this person was struggling with some serious demons. Outside the motel, there was a storage container with "Keep Out" spray painted across it. Naturally, we were curious. There was a hole in the side, and someone reached in and pulled out more documents. Among them was a letter, possibly from the VA, judging by the government-style letterhead, informing the person who wrote those letters that he had unknowingly been part of hallucinogenic substance tests during his time in the military. To make things even creepier, there was a room in the abandoned motel that was completely sealed off. We were strictly forbidden from going near it. The windows were boarded up with plywood, and the door was barricaded shut. And the smell coming from it was like death. I've never smelled anything worse in my life. I can't verify whether this is an actual family story or just an urban legend, but here it is. My family has lived in rural Nebraska since they immigrated from Germany in the mid-1800s. Near the turn of the century, disease was rampant in the homesteading area, claiming the lives of members in almost every family. When someone died from illness, it was crucial to bury them quickly to prevent the virus from spreading further. This meant there were no wake periods. One of my distant aunts, whose exact relation to me is lost in the generations, died from some illness and was buried in the family cemetery on the homestead. She had always been fond of the family dogs, so it wasn't surprising when, after her funeral, the two dogs stayed near her grave. However, as the days passed, the family started to worry. Even after a week and a half, the dogs were still at the grave, acting distressed. They weren't just lying there. They were frantic, barking constantly and pacing around. Something clearly wasn't right. After nearly 2 weeks of this behavior, the family decided to investigate. They dug up the casket and opened it, and what they found was horrifying. All of the deceased's hair had been pulled out. Her fingers were raw, bloody, and mangled. Deep scratches were carved into the inside of the casket door. It became clear that she hadn't been dead when they buried her. She had been in a coma and regained consciousness underground, spending what were likely the last 5 days of her life trapped inside her own casket.